Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We are halfway through the week. You did it. Um, Thanks for tuning in to our Conversations with the Curator series. This is a once a month lunch and learn style series that brings you behind the scenes of our collections and our exhibits. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at NCHGS, and today I am joined by my colleague Tim Betts, our Curator of Exhibitions. Today, Tim will take us on the quite remarkable life and journey of Lucretia Bradley Hubbell, whose name to me sort of sounds like someone who enjoys some afternoon gardening and making little tea sandwiches. And I promise you that is not at all the case here. Lucretia was the first woman to make a solo balloon flight. Although if you've tuned into this series before, you'll imagine that there is so much more to that story than meets the eye. Lucretia had a career that can respectfully be described as colorful, let's say. In addition to her balloon ascension ambitions, Tim, can you give us a little bit of information on her background and kind of what led up to the famous balloon ascension?
Sure. So Lucretia Bradley is fascinating because we talk about the balloon ascension, and I'll talk about the balloon ascension more and kind of like a entry point to the how she gets in that balloon, let's say, in 1855. But this is this kind of remarkable little thing where it's like we think of this woman making this balloon journey, and like the balloon is only, to the best I can gather, that time she gets in that balloon in Easton in 1855 is the only time she does that, unless there's another unrecorded time. But like the balloon flight and what happens on the balloon flight is a couple hours of one day in Lucretia Bradley Hubbell's life. So that's interesting, right? Because you think of like this remarkable woman that becomes this first American woman anyway to ride in a balloon and be up to all sorts of balloon escapades. More on that in a minute, but that's only part of it, and like maybe even a little bit of a side journey for her. So what I'm gonna do, and I promise I'll not get bogged down in this, but it's about balloons in the 19th century. So I mean, this is, if I dare say, fun stuff. So I'm gonna share my screen because I have pictures of balloons anyway. Did that work? Do you have John Weiss?
Oh, there we go. Yep.
There we go. Okay. So the story of Lucretia Bradley, and it starts with John Weiss in part because Lucretia Bradley gets her balloon from John Weiss. So John Weiss, he is from 1808 to 1879. Balloons and the idea of ballooning is an 18th century thing. So the first balloon flight happens in Paris, and that is in 1783. So that is this moment where he, people, it is like a scientific thing. People get in the balloon and ultimately they're like, how do balloons work? How does flight work? Right. And we humans have been like obsessed with the idea of figuring out how to fly for centuries. Right. So balloon flights happening in the 18th century, and that'll really just be like people going up in a balloon and like, here I am at this place, I'm in a balloon. They'll send like animals up in the balloon. They'll do all sorts of stuff in the balloon. But our story starts with John Weiss, and not to like say like Lucretia Bradley and then now a man, but he is important to the story. So John Weiss is an American balloonist, and he's actually a Pennsylvania balloonist. He's born in Lancaster. He makes his first balloon flight in 1835. He does that in Philadelphia. And then it seems like he catches the balloon bug. So he, in his life of 44 years, he will do 463 balloon ascensions, where he will go up in the balloon. So he is like Lucretia Bradley, she's a one-time balloonist. John Weiss is an all-the-time balloonist. So there's some John Weiss things that I think are telling and kind of tell us what motivates Lucretia Bradley when she's in Easton about to do the thing, right? So John Weiss in 1838 takes out an advertisement in the Easton paper in March. Mr. Weiss celebrated aeronaut, which I love. They don't call them like balloonists, they call them aeronauts, which pro that, great word. Intends gratifying the citizens of Easton with a balloon ascension through the course of next month, provided a sufficient sum shall be subscribed to justify him making the necessary arrangements. The expense of inflating a balloon amounts to nearly $400. That's the equivalent of around $4,000 today. So it's not just like having a balloon and making the balloon go. It requires 8,000 pounds of oil of vitriol, 2,500 pounds of iron turnings and granulated zinc, together with an extensive apparatus for the production of hydrogen gas. Weiss's balloon and Lucretia Bradley's balloon are not what we would call a hot air balloon, where you have like you have the thing and you turn the thing and the fire comes out and hot air is lighter than cold air and it rises. They're hydrogen balloons, which hydrogen can be used for balloons. It is lighter than helium, actually, so it ascends. But there is a problem with hydrogen, and the problem with hydrogen is it is explosive. So that will play a part in this as well. So hydrogen, explosive. Why I bring this up is that money. So when Weiss comes to Easton, and when Lucretia Bradley comes to Easton, it's not just like aeronaut shows up with balloon and balloon go up. Rather, it is aeronaut shows up and usually they're invited there, right? Like the town or a group of citizens. These people here become known as the people in Easton working on this are like the friends of John Weiss. Just kind of like a little impromptu friends group. And they fundraise. So some of that goes to the raising of the balloon, but some of that goes to the aeronaut, right? So it's like these people are making money off of this, off of the balloon ascension. So John Weiss comes and he advertises in March that he's going to do that. And then something horrible happens. So
A disappointment.
What was that?
A disappointment.
A disappointment.
That's it.
At
That's
the end of April, thousands of citizens, which like I'm boggled by that, but thousands of citizens come to watch Weiss raise this balloon. And there's like impromptu stands built in Easton for them to watch the balloon go up. They meet there at a certain time, and John Weiss struggles for hours to make the balloon go up. The balloon doesn't go up. So he's there while thousands of people are watching him try to make this balloon go up. The balloon doesn't go up and he sends them home. Which, like, imagine that. So that's part one. And that's not even like the wild part. So then by August, this gets figured out. John Weiss thinks he's going to be able to do it. The friends of John Weiss kind of re-raise the money, and they are going to do the balloon ascension. I should note, like, for those of you familiar with Easton, this is happening in Center Square. So it's happening like right there where the century previously, the Declaration of Independence is read. So John Weiss is there. In August, he goes up in his balloon. Something happens then John Weiss did not intend, which is that while he is up there in the air making his flight, he goes up and he's like up in the air, and then the balloon pops while he's in the air. And it's like talking about how he goes up and like imagine how this works. And I always feel like this would be kind of like an awkward event to go to. So like you're going and you're watching the balloon go up and you're all sitting there, and then the balloon goes up And then it's over, right? Because like the balloon isn't tethered, like John Weiss wasn't tethered. Lucretia Bradley isn't tethered. So it's not like the balloon goes up and then just hovers there and then it comes back down. The balloon goes up and he goes away. So like it's like, okay, we're done now. And then I guess you just go about your day. But John Weiss goes up, drifts over the Delaware River, and at some point while he is over New Jersey, the balloon punctures. He then lands. Because one of the things he had been interested in, so the other side thing of this, and there's so many like things of this, right? Like he's not just like going up in the balloon, he's also like doing science somewhat, right? So like quotes around that. But one of the things he's very interested in is like, if you puncture a balloon, could the balloon become a parachute? So like, could the balloon ultimately be its own safety device? He learns accidentally, yes. So the balloon lands and he gets recovered in like Warren County, Warren County, New Jersey, just kind of right over the border. Then John Weiss does what you expect him to do, or what is the most deranged answer for him, which is he says, I did it once. Then in October, he advertises that not only is he going to go back up in his balloon in Easton, he's going to pop it on purpose. So he goes up, he pops the balloon, same, he's kind of doing like somewhat science, right? So it's the same thing happens. He lands, great. And that's what people are talking about. So John Weiss becomes this kind of sensation. He becomes in 1859, he becomes the first person in the United States, well, probably in the world, to do an airmail delivery, where he delivers mail in his balloon. So 1859, decades before the first airplane is invented, John Weiss is delivering airmail. The Civil War comes and they're going to use balloons during the Civil War. John Weiss attempts to do that, but he doesn't have the backing of the scientific establishment. So the Union Army doesn't put him in charge of the balloons, and he was very upset about that. So that happens, but eventually an air station for ballooning gets named after him in San Antonio, Texas. So good for John Weiss. So after the balloon ascension and before the Civil War. Oh, I have these. So here's an image from our collection of a balloon ascension in 1885. Not sure where this is, but this is a 19th century image of what a balloon ascension would look like. Look at the spectacle of it, right? Like, this is a spectacle event. This is the balloon. It's in the street. Look at all these people there. And like, for me, it's like the children climbing up the building, the people looking out the window. And like, not only that, like people sitting on this roof watching the balloon go up, right? So it's like, this is like big public spectacle people are going. So we're getting to Lucretia Bradley. So John Weiss bursts his balloon. He writes about it in a book he writes, Through the Air, in 1873. Here's an image from our collection of that descent, where I think he looks probably significantly calmer than he probably actually was. I think that probably was a little bit, I think things were really hairy there for him for a minute. Enter then, look, while she is in Easton, her name is Lucretia Bradley. This is an image, and this is the only known, I've hunted for longer than I'd like to admit, for a photograph of Lucretia Bradley and have not found one. This is an image that appears kind of broadly throughout newspapers after her ascension. So probably mid 1854, Lucretia Bradley, a woman from Connecticut, whose early life we actually kind of know somewhat little about. She buys a balloon from John Weiss. John Weiss had many balloons. She buys a balloon from him. He gives her a somewhat lousy balloon, and she brings the balloon to Easton. I think she's bringing it to Easton to like kind of recreate that like Weiss's grand moment of his 1838 ascension. So she comes in September of 1855, and she is going to do the balloon then. She goes to raise the balloon on Friday the 13th of September. Bad choice. And she goes there in the morning, and the balloon has been vandalized by balloon vandals. But I shouldn't call them balloon vandals. That makes it sound like that's a thing that happens. The balloon is vandalized. So she then is in a holding pattern, right? So let's do the Ascension thing first, and then we can kind of do the more of that, right? So like she appears in Easton and in September 84, 1884. I mean 1850, sorry, 1854. Her balloon ascension is in February 1855. These dates are all there's dates that appear in all sorts of things and they all appear contradictory. The date I've kind of come that seems to hold up the strongest is February 1855. Lucretia Bradley gets in her balloon in Center Square. The Easton Whig, one of the local newspapers, says of her that although she is not the most beautiful when on terra firma, it was remarked by many that when she cut the rope, dressed as she was in her hippodrome costume with a French crown cap, white feather, encircled with green and white flowers, she looked like a fairy. I can't get that out of my mind, which is obvious, like what she looks like here, right? So she gets in the balloon, she cuts the rope, the balloon raises up. Then something happens. The balloon pops while she's over the Delaware River, and she lands and she gives this, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but she gives this long like description of the flight where she spends like almost a page of newsprint. We're talking like multiple columns talking about like the things she saw as the balloon drifted down after it popped. She lands in a field over in New Jersey. She's like drifting over to New Jersey. They're all drifting over to New Jersey. She lands in a field and like the people find her and they're like, obviously this woman is dead, right? But she's not. So that is the Lucretia Bradley flight, right? So she does a really short flight in February. She becomes the first American woman to do a solo balloon flight. The balloon pops, and then remarkably, she lands in New Jersey basically without a scratch on her. She's described as like just kind of sitting calmly in the field. Here's an image from John Weiss's Through the Air of Lucretia Bradley and her balloon popping. All the contemporary newspapers described her as a like strong Yankee gal, which I think is always kind of fun. But that's the Lucretia Bradley story. At least the one element of her story. So yes, Aaron.
So she, unlike John Wise, right? She was not, what was the term they used? Aeronaut?
She was described as an aeronaut. She's
Okay.
described as a female aeronaut or a
Oh,
lady aeronaut.
ooh.
Yeah.
So why do you think, because she wasn't from Easton, right? Do you think that there's a specific reason that she chose Easton?
I do have a theory on this, and this is solely conjectural, right? So I think it is very remarkably similar how John Weiss's flight that becomes this kind of sensation that people talk about, right?
Mhm.
Like he gets up, he's flying, the balloon pops, which you don't want your balloon to do that. And he kind of lands coolly on the ground and then does it again.
Mhm.
I think she buys the balloon from John Weiss.
Mhm.
And I think her choice of Easton is an attempt to kind of somewhat replicate that.
Uh,
So my suspicion and like the contemporary papers just talk about like how the balloon pops, kind of all of this sort of stuff. It is just remarkably similar and
mhm.
even a touch suspicious that like the John Weiss balloon and the Lucretia Bradley balloon, the same thing happens, right? So it's kind of what my thought is, and my thought on this is like partly connected to the other stuff Lucretia Bradley's into, is that she is replicating John Weiss's flight as a kind of a feat, right? As a public spectacle
Mhm.
in an effort to like gain fame and notoriety.
Uh,
It works, right?
yeah.
And it would have worked, I think, even if the balloon didn't pop, right? So it's like, and the kind of thing I want to like be sure about, right? It's like she is fascinating and I think very much of her time, but like just because she would be replicating what John Weiss did, I don't think necessarily negates the kind of awesomeness of her as a woman in 1855 doing this, right? Like in a society that wouldn't necessarily be necessarily okay with it, right? So it's like, I think really, I don't want to, darken the accomplishment of this first female aeronaut.
So I have a lot of thoughts right now. So given what we know about her background and her probably not coincidental similarities with
Mhm.
John Weiss, we think that do you think it's a fair assumption to say that she probably made the balloon pop on purpose out of, would you say it's more of like trying to retest like a scientific theory on her own, or more so just for the spectacle?
I think that's very possible, right?
Yeah.
So I think in the 19th century, at this time, especially like ballooning and stuff like this is like the time of like science as spectacle, right? So it's like
Mm.
science and spectacle, like these balloon flights, uh, experiments with electricity, right? Like these sort of things are both science and public entertainment, right? So I think she is gaining notoriety, but I would not be shocked that she is
Mm.
also doing this for science because
Mm.
she is doing other stuff for science,
Mm.
right? So like I think she is I think she's trying all sorts of stuff.
Mhm.
Right. And maybe she considered it because she never gets in a balloon again, at least it
Oh.
seems, right? So I think it's like maybe she considered it like experiment solved. I did the thing. Um, but yeah, I think that's a really good question, right? And I think there's only ultimately I think one person knows, and it's Lucretia Bradley, right?
I think this might be a good point to segue into also some of the other uh, less scientifically based scientific activities she
Correct,
was
right?
involved in. I
Because
don't
I
know
did
how else to say
say
that.
yes, because Lucretia Bradley, she is only the balloon is really just the narrow thing. Because, like, for me, it's the question of what is she doing while she is in Easton from September 1854 to her balloon ascension in February 1855, where then she leaves town, right? She goes away. And what she is doing and what she had been doing previously to that and what she does after that is lectures on phrenology. Lucretia Bradley was a phrenologist. So phrenology, that is, she actually writes a book about phrenology, which I'm trying to get my mitts on. It seems to be really hard to get. A guide to life and character containing a chart of the phrenological developments of and given by Lucretia Bradley Hubbell, practical phrenologist. She's married here. So phrenology. Phrenology is and she's writing about it. She is a practicing phrenologist. She is also broadly traveling and lecturing on phrenology. So, what's phrenology? Phrenology is a 19th century pseudoscience. Like, I can't stress how much of a like not real science this is, but it's something that people in the 19th century did a lot of. So ultimately, if you're visiting a phrenologist or if you are a practitioner of phrenology, what that means is that someone will come to you and you, like this gentleman in this picture, take your hands and you rub them on their skull and or their head because you can't get to their skull. But you rub them on their head, and you feel where there are bumps in their skull. The bumps in the skull indicate where their brain has a particular, like, more of it. Because the thought of phrenology is that, and the organs of the brain, that's what they called it, the organs of the brain. If there were organs of the brain that were more powerful, they would become larger, they would become like engorged, and ones that were less powerful would become shriveled up. And that what that would do is cause different bumps on your head. So there's charts for that, where like there's different zones of the head. There are phrenology heads. These are always like popping up at like antique stores. These were like phrenology was a broadly practiced thing in the 19th century. So like Lucretia Bradley is not an outlier. And these heads then like I like this one because it really kind of like shows you a little more how this works, right? So you can have like the zone of friendship. And like if you're a particularly good friend, that zone will be like a little bit more like pronounced on your brain, or like the area of acquisitiveness. And if you have like a divot there, it means you're not very acquisitive. The area of self-esteem. And if you have like a divot there, which I'm actually feeling, I kind of think I do have a divot there, that means you don't have much self-esteem, which is an interesting thought. So you would have these charts, and then you go around and you would do this to ultimately talk about the things that were wrong, or like virtues that people had. This quickly, right? So like phrenology, like there is no scientific backing for this. This is not how the brain works. This is not how any of this works. This quickly, and like I can't stress this enough, quickly, immediately becomes tied to like structures of racial superiority, right? So it gets like there are different shapes of heads that like white people and people of color have, and that is depicting, in phrenological belief that shows their like, inferiority, right? And then that'll even be like comparing races that aren't white as being closer to apes, or like animal like. So like phrenology is very much a pseudoscience, but phrenology is really kind of a racialized weapon in the 19th century, right? Like this is a on-ramp to eugenics and stuff like that. Not saying that Lucretia Bradley is doing that. There's no kind of documented stuff about what she is doing in her lectures, but like phrenology becomes that, right? We know she's well known in these circles. I forgot even another thing. She appears in the American Annals for the Deaf and Dumb in 1870, where she cures a man of being deaf by essentially like rubbing his head and putting stuff in his ear. No evidence as to how that goes. And it's kind of like, I go, we shall watch this case with great interest and report progress, said the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb. But we know she's well known because in 1858, her marriage to the artist Algernon Sidney Hubbell is reported in the American Phrenology Journal, a repository of science, literature, and general intelligence. So there she is marrying him in August 10th, 1858. So she's well enough known as a phrenologist. And this is 3 years after her flight, right? Which 3 years after the flight she makes, it's not mentioned here in the Phrenological Journal. Rather, her work, widely known in the Middle and Western states, as a lecturer of phrenology. And she marries, he is from New Haven, Connecticut as well. And if you'll remember a couple slides back, that book is actually published under her husband's name, Algernon Sidney Hubbell, but it's written by her. The other thing she gets into, because we could go on forever, is she gets into patent medicine. So in 1875, she's patents a electric anti-bilious pill. No idea what that does, but it is against biliousness. And in 1882, she patents a spore killer. These are both patent medicines that she is selling. I've dropped in here Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment, where we get the broadly used phrase snake oil salesman, right? This idea of in the 19th century, patent medicine existed, and ultimately they were cure-alls that had like stuff in them that did some stuff, but like usually they didn't do the things they said they did. So like here's Hamlin's wizard oil in the 19th
Yes.
century, good for your rheumatism. Another good example, which I'm doing these quick because I could quickly go down like a snake oil rabbit hole, is Waterbury's metabolized cod liver oil compound, which the ad for it says the merits of our cocaine. So it does something. Uh,
That it
Probably
does.
it does something. So she's doing phrenology, she is curing the deaf, she is producing patent medicine, and that is like what she is doing, right? So then like the balloon is like the one thing. She does like the balloon as a like a side thing for her. So like the balloon is actually fascinating to me because the balloon is the outlier, right?
That's a lot to take in there. Um,
She's
I,
a busy lady.
where do you start, honestly?
Oh no.
As I'm staring right at this, the merits of our cocaine. Learn from the past, kids. Learn from the past.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, so here's a I I know you want to get to this a little bit, but we have two obituaries for her. I mean, at least two that we know of. And
Yeah, I have these slides for them here.
there we go. There we go.
Yeah, yeah.
Tim, what is so special about these two?
What's special about them? So she dies in 1907. The other thread I let drop is the John Weiss thread. So just a note on that. John Weiss dies in 1877 when his balloon is traveling over Lake Michigan, making a flight over Lake Michigan to deliver mail. He's on it with another guy. The balloon and John Weiss are never seen again. The other guy's body is brought out of Lake Michigan. So I think things went poorly for John Weiss. Lucretia Bradley lives till 1907. She dies in like early March 1907. We've just passed it, right? So like probably March 11, give or take. She dies in Connecticut. She is listed in both of in like her obituaries as like the Boston paper talks about her as a lecturer of phrenology and then talks about the balloon ascension. The Washington Post talks about the balloon ascension. But what's really interesting is two things. In the Boston Globe, she dies at the age of 58 in 1907. And in the Washington Post, she dies at the age of 86. Uh, those are different ages. Those are very different ages. And I know which one I am pro. I'm not a math person, but I did some math. And if the Boston Globe's date is correct, that she is 58 at the time of her death in 1907, that would mean that at the time of her balloon ascension, she was 6 years old, which is something that absolutely the newspaper would have said. In addition to describing her as a fairy wearing her hippodrome costume, it would have said, this was a child getting in this balloon, and we watched as she did this. The Washington Post date, which is probably the right one, where she's 86, that would mean that at the time of the balloon ascension, she was 34.
So I know this could open up a much broader conversation with some other things you have planned in the future, but for the purposes of even if say the Boston Globe is one short paragraph, Washington Post is two short paragraphs, why do you think that there is such a distinction between the two of them? Like what do you think, as a historian, what likely happened
My
to give those
suspicion
two
is a
dates?
my suspicion is a typo. So my suspicion is that the Boston Globe, when it was being typeset, they
Oh,
transposed the 8 and a 5 because
oh.
85 is pretty close to 86. So I think it's not this massive like I don't think she I don't think she was lying about her age or anything. Like that I love this like side journey where she's like talking about herself as being 30 years younger. But I think it is as simple as like the news report came in, like on the Telegraph or
Mhm.
however, and they take it off the wire and they whoever is writing it transposes the numbers and then it just passes through.
Mhm.
Right. So I think it's very similar to that. And you're absolutely, I mean, like one of the things we're working on for 2026 is an exhibit that talks or like surrounding America's 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration is an exhibit about misinformation in the news in the 18th century and maybe talking about the present a bit. So like this does like raise kind of immediate red flags, but I mean I think it's as simple as just a number flip.
Plain old human error.
Plain old human error.
Yeah. Yeah. So funnily enough, when I was doing some research on her, this was the thing that I found, and I had just done a simple Google search, and I'm reading them, and I'm like, oh, that's so fascinating that both of her obituaries, as short as they are, mention Easton. Isn't that funny that Easton is mentioned in the Boston Globe and the Washington Post? And I was like, wait a minute. I am certainly not a mathematician. Dare I say I am not even good at math, but that's a difference there.
That is a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Major difference.
Yeah.
I
And
think it is. I mean, it's definitely interesting though, because like the Washington Post doesn't even mention, like, there's no mention of the phrenology, right? That she's
yeah.
a widely known lecturer and publishing on phrenology and doing all of this stuff. No mention of her journeys into patent medicine. None of that. She just here is the balloonist, right? A woman aeronaut that does
Mhm.
the being the first woman to go up in a balloon in this country. So it's like that one moment really just becomes exceptionally famous for her. I mean, of course, we could think of all sorts of people we think of as, celebrities or that are well known, that it's like one specific moment in their life is the thing we remember about them, right? The first line of their obituary, as it were.
Does anyone have any questions about this wild journey that we have just been on?
And like her journey was a little more wild, I think, but I admit it's a really wild journey.
Which of our conversations so far though hasn't been a wild journey? Let's be honest. No questions? Really? I was filled with questions. Tim, anything you want to close in on?
I mean, I think I'm just like very fascinated by this idea because I find her really fascinating, right? Because I think she definitely seems like this person, and like there's just these kind of like really what we have are these like like the newspaper stuff about her, right? But
Mhm.
she really seems like someone that is like part of the hustle, as we would say, right? Like she is doing the thing, and like she does not seem like she is just kind of like puttering around a garden, right? Like she
Right.
is like out there doing stuff, right? And like kind of like making a name for herself. And like in the 19th century, that's not unheard of for women to be doing that, right? But she is really, I think she's like the thing she's doing is quite remarkable, even outside of the balloon, even if we think of what she's doing as like pseudoscience and patent medicine, right?
Mhm.
But like she's really, really cool. And I mean, she is also very much of she's very much of her time, right? Like this is like the 19th century, like after Civil War, before 1900. Like this is the time of like big public spectacle. This is the
Mm,
time of
mhm,
like people becoming really engaged in like these new ideas. It's like this development of what we think of as the modern world,
mhm,
right? Like
mhm,
news as we know it, more fast travel, the development of new technologies. And like she is kind of a part of that, right? And she shows us the messiness of that, right? Because
yeah,
she's
yeah,
like
for sure.
doing all these things and like patenting medicines and like making money off of them. And like who knows what's in those anti-bilious pills. But
Yeah, she's just really just this tiny little speck in the greater microcosm of what the hell was happening the second half of the 19th century. Great question. I have no idea. But the world is opening up and everybody wants to get their little piece of the pie and everybody wants to dabble dip their toes in the big new world.
absolutely, yeah, it's like the era of like the big world's fairs and the like, like these like the last hurrah of these like great empires. It's like the Gilded Age, right? It's this like,
Yeah, yeah.
there are like the very poor and the super rich and just kind of like the great spectacle of it all.
Wow, that doesn't sound familiar at all.
There,
Weird.
right?
All right, everyone. Well, thank you again for such another great conversation. As a reminder, you do not need to register in advance for these programs. Every time we post up on the Sigel Museum events page, there will be a link to the Zoom. You can just straight click on that. So please send along to anybody who would be interested, who would like to tune in. Next, I almost said next week. No, it is not next week. Slow down. Next month, which will be April. Here we go again with the math. April 24th. Tim will talk about his book on maker spaces in museums, which you should talk more about the fact that you wrote a book. That is a big deal, sir.
It's an obnoxious thing to say to people.
Well, I wrote a book, not to brag. But you wrote a book, Tim. No one made you do that, but you did it anyway. Oh, here's once again, Howie with the answer. The photo of her flight appears to be in Center Square. The buildings seem to be Easton Exchange and the Detweiler buildings.
Okay.
There you go. We were puzzling about that earlier.
We shall make note of it, Howie.
Thank you. Howie to the rescue.
Yep.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks again, and we will see you all next month. This will be recorded and put up on our YouTube, so keep an eye out on our Facebook and our Instagram pages. I'll post up the photo and the link once it's up and everything. Again, I try my best to edit all of the closed captioning for greatest accessibility. So feel free to pass along once it's up. I hope to have it up by the end of next week, but fingers crossed if my technology cooperates. And we will see you all next month.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.